Hey everyone, it's John here from Cast and Shoot Outdoors, CNS Outdoors on YouTube. Hey, it's been a little bit since we've had any videos come up. Want to apologize about that. Back earlier this spring, we had a hard drive go out on our computer. We lost all of our videos that we had, but now that problem's been fixed and we're ready to go. It got me thinking here about deer hunting in my next video. And so this year we were out and I was pretty fortunate. My bow season, I was able to get a buck and a doe, filled the freezer with some meat. That was kind of the objective this year. I wanted to find deer and I wanted to find them fast. I only had basically 5 days to hunt this year. And I thought, you know what? Let's do this. Let's shoot a video. That being said, I can give you some pointers on where to look and what to look for. So I'm pretty fortunate. Here in Wisconsin, where I live, I'm right off the Mississippi River. I've hunted the river bottoms for years. We have a lot of agriculture and what we call the Bluff Country here. A lot of big hills. It's where the glaciers had stopped and basically made small mountains. So we have that type of terrain. Like I said, we have the river bottoms of the Mississippi, we have the hill country, and then where our land is situated, that is in the flatlands. So I'm going to go through each scenario of what to look for, what I like to hunt, and hopefully this is going to help you. So in order to find deer fast, you have to know a few things. Number one, you always got to play the wind, right? But two, a lot of people talk about edges, and edges are super important. A couple different types of edges are a hard edge, and that's where you'll see a field meet the woods, or the field meets the swamp. That's a hard edge. Then you have soft edges, and soft edges are a little different. It might be where the swamp and the woods meet, and in that spot you have maybe the grass goes to willows or sumac, and then it changes over to conifers. Then it might lead to the hardwoods. Those are edges where you have two different types of vegetation meet. Might be where the water meets the island. That's another edge. So I'm not going to get too much on the edges. I think people understand what edges are, and of course there's videos out there from others that talk about edge. Well, yeah, you have to hunt the edges because that's where the deer feel safest. But I'll let that part of it go. You pretty much understand that. Where I like to hunt is more the transition areas. That's what I'm going to kind of talk about. But in order to understand your different areas of what you look for to find deer fast, you have to know a few things. Okay? So wind, once again, is very important, and I'm going to get into thermals and what thermals are and how to hunt them. Okay, so let's start on your river bottom areas. When hunting river bottom areas, what you got to do? Well, let me back up one moment. First, you have to understand where your feeding areas are. You have to learn where your bedding areas are, and then your transition areas. Okay? When I look on maps, Google Map, Onyx, even back when I started hunting, way back when, because I've been hunting over 40 years, I use topography maps. And topography maps, Onyx, Google, they'll all show you those elevations. So that's something to keep in mind here, and I'll kind of get into what the reasoning is why I like to look for them. So in a river bottom setting, Mississippi River. I like to look for the bigger islands. The bigger islands and the high spots on those topography maps, that's going to be where your oaks are. Oaks are very predominant in my area, especially in the bottomlands and up on the hill countries. Oaks are probably the number one tree for the most part. And they all produce acorns. Well, not all the trees do, but that's where acorns come from, is oak trees. So I look for these high spots on the islands. The deer are going to feed on those acorns because that's pretty much all they have. But there are a couple other types of scenarios too. You will find dogwood on these islands, and dogwoods is a soft mass. Then the other thing that I find that they'll feed on is, they call it duck potato, but it's arrowhead. And deer really like the arrowhead. It holds a lot of moisture. It actually is in the water. It's not going to be up on land. It's going to grow in the water. So that's your feeding areas that you're going to look for. On the high spots, it's going to be the oak. On the edges, you're going to find your soft mass dogwood, and in the water itself is going to be the arrowheads. Where I like to hunt are those transition areas. And what you'll find is where two islands come closest together, that's where those deer are going to travel. They do swim. Deer have hollow hair and they float, and they will swim. I've seen a lot of deer swim in the Mississippi River, but they're going to swim the shortest distance is what they're going to try to do. So where I look on is the neck down areas, whether that's the end of the island or maybe it's an hourglass shape where, kind of thins out in the middle. In those areas I like to look for. And another place that I call drains. And that's where you'll see where the water came through the islands when it was high and carved out a little spot, and that water will flow from one side of the island to the other, and then when it dries up, of course, you have this ditch there. Well, the deer will travel, like I said, through the end of that island. They'll go through those neck downs. But where I find those drains really important is when there's a lot of pressure from gun hunting. We have a couple different rivers that all meet down in my area here at La Crosse. And the Black River itself is one of the rivers that flows into Mississippi in the bottomlands. So it's a lot more wide. It's not these huge islands that you'll see that have a lot of water in between them like the Mississippi does. They're smaller islands, but they can have high spots, and that's where your oaks are going to grow. So when gun deer season happens, you'll see these deer, they'll travel along these drains because they can dip down in them and stay hidden. I've shot a number of deer in these drains where the landowners that own land on both sides of the river, they'll be hunting, they'll make drives, and they push the deer down into these islands. And when the deer get to these islands, again, they're going to come on those connecting spots, and then they're going to walk through those drains. So that's the transition areas I like to hunt. So now let's talk about the upland, the bluff areas where there's a lot of agriculture in my area. Okay, so when I said remember the winds at this time and the thermals, well, the thermals are when the air rises and cools. So in the Bluff Country where I'm at, you'll see you don't see very many farm fields on the hillsides. It just doesn't happen because they are so steep. So where our farm fields and the agriculture are set are up on the very tops or at the very bottoms. Okay? That's where your food generally is, but you have a lot of oaks, as I said, beforehand. They'll feed in those oaks when they start dropping those acorns. they will go to it because that's the protein that they want. So you'll also have them feed in clear cuts. A lot of the landowners do clear cutting around here. It's not like it used to be back in the late 70s and early 80s, but people are starting to see the benefits of clear cutting or selective harvest because it opens up, brings a lot more light, and now you got the shoots in. Okay, so there's where those deer are feeding. All right. When it comes to the bedding areas almost always seem to be where the thickest areas on those hillsides are. Maybe they did some selective cuts and they left those tops down. The deer love to be bedded up next to a stump or a tree that's fallen down. You'll see that quite a bit. And usually I'll see more does laying in those types of scenarios and bedding in those scenarios. The bucks, unless it's the rut, they don't want to be with those does. They just don't. So where I find these bucks laying, they're going to be on what I call the finger points. And those deer love to lay on those points. They lay about 3/4 up on the hill is what it seems like. They'll find this little flat spot, a little saddle, if that's what you want to call it. And they'll lay right there on that little flat spot. So now they can see all the way below them. They have the wind at their backs, so they can smell anything that's coming over the top. They can hear stuff that's coming over the top. When I've seen these deer laying on these points, and I've shot a lot of them off of it during gun season, you don't generally get too close to them bow season. Once in a while you do, depending upon where you're walking and how quiet you are. But what I've seen, these deer, these big bucks, laying on these points, they're always looking down, and they always have their ears back so they can hear what's ever coming from behind them. Almost always. It's very seldom that you don't see them like that. If you see a hillside with cedars, almost guarantee you those bucks, well, I shouldn't say just the bucks, but those deer are going to be bedded in those cedars. I know Grant Woods on his channel doesn't care for those cedars, but you know what? In our area, those deer love to bed underneath those cedar trees if they can. So, they don't have a nutritional value. That's for sure. And Grant points that out. But when it comes to bedding on a hillside, if you got cedars, that's money for you. So now we've covered both the bedding and the feeding area. So now here's what I like to do for the transition areas and how I hunt them. So I'm going to go back to these thermals. In the morning, your thermals are rising. As the sun comes up, it's heating the air, and the air will rise. What I find most of the time is that these deer will walk 3/4 hill. Again, it goes back to like they like to lay up there, but they can hear anything that's above them, and they can see and smell anything that's below them. So in the mornings, I always try to hunt, if I can, about 3/4 up high on those hills. One of my biggest bucks I've shot, probably is my biggest buck I shot, that was the case. I caught him in the morning. He was walking 3/4 of the hillside, up on that hillside, and he was sent checking for does. In the evenings, now your thermals are coming down. Those deer go down to the farm fields that are at the bottom of the hills. Maybe there's a creek that runs through there, so they're getting water. Whatever the reason is, for their food and waters at the bottom, you'll see these deer traveling along the edges at the bottoms. Again, it might be the creek bottom itself, that edge. It might be the difference between the field and, the inside of the woods. Maybe there's some sumac that runs along that edge. But you'll see those deer, they'll skirt that edge until they feel safe and want to come out into the open, whether it's the agricultural field or that creek bottom. So that's a spot that I like to look for as a transition. The last place that I look for, and it kind of went back to this buck that I was telling you about I shot up high. We have a lot of ravines in this area too, where the water will run down from the top of the hill, and it's over the years it's created these nice steep ravines. Well, what my dad taught me was these deer will cross in 3 different spots. And if they don't feel comfortable crossing up top, there's got to be a spot in the middle that they're going to cross on. And if they don't cross in the middle, it's all the way at the bottom. Those are the 3 places that you'll find, and almost always there's a heavy run that goes to these crossings. So now we've come to the last place, which is I call it the flatlands. So in the flatlands, where I found the bedding areas to be are usually the thickest spots that you can find, but that thickest spot turns out to be swamp most of the time. At least in my area it's swamp. Or, it's the conifer stands that have a mix in them, or a clear cut that's probably, depending upon the age, we'll say that 8 to 10-year-old clear cut, because by that time that it's so thick you can't hardly see 20 30 yards past it. Quite honestly, on my land, my farthest shot is probably, I have 2 spots where I can shoot 40 yards at a max. So even though I can use a rifle, when it comes to gun deer season, I use my 20 gauge. Now, on the opposite side, the feeding areas, they are going to be the oaks. They are going to be the clear cuts, the new clear cuts, 1 to 3-year-old. And your dogwoods, whether they're along the edges of the swamp or the edges of the clear cut, because dogwoods grow up very fast. They're a soft mass, but those deer love to eat dogwoods. They love to eat the young shoots of popple. They love to eat the young shoots of maple trees. So those are the areas that I look for. And just to kind of add on that, if you look at the topography map, again, you're going to see dark green areas, and they're going to be generally higher. So those are the areas I look for. That's usually the oak trees that grow up high. So now we want to get to the transition areas. And this is the stuff that I always want to hunt, again, whether it's bottomland, bluff country, or the lowlands. So in the lowlands, what you'll find is where these big bedding areas are, there's a drain, but it's a little different type of a drain than what I was talking about in the river bottoms. These drains, they're almost like a finger from these swamps that'll go up into a little bit higher elevation. And it's still a swamp, but on the edge of those swamps, you'll have your willow trees, you'll have your red dozier dogwoods, but then there's a couple more types of trees, whether they're sumac, I'm not really sure. But those deer will use those drains, and they'll walk those edges on their way up to their feeding areas. Once again, usually a clear cut or an oak ridge is where I find them. Another transition area that I find is where you do find these little bit of rises in these lowland areas, or flatland areas, I should say, not lowland, but the flatland areas. You might find a little bit of a hill. In that hill, you'll find a low spot. Maybe it's an old logging road. Again, just it's a spot where the waters run, and it's carved off that little bit of a ditch. You'll find those deer, they like to travel those lowland spots because they don't want to be seen. Sometimes they'll walk right down a logging road. But the one thing you will never find them walking on that logging road is a straight logging road. If it's winding, those deer don't feel nearly as nervous walking down a winding logging road as you will a straight where you can see 50, 60, 70 yards. I'll see them crossing it, but I usually don't see them walking down those logging roads. So there again, if you want to sit on a logging road, it's perfectly fine because that's a nice edge. But don't choose one that's a straight shot. You just are not going to find that the deer want to walk those long stretches and be out in the open. But if you can find that little bit of a spot where maybe there's a low spot in that along that logging road, that's where you're going to find those deer cross, or that's where they're going to come up and in onto that logging road. So with those tips, I hope it helps you, puts to good use. I know it's really helped me keeping those things in mind. Once again, you want to play the wind. You want to understand where your feeding and bedding areas are, and then try to find those transition spots in between. If you can find those, you're going to see more deer. I'll guarantee it. And with that said, I appreciate the support. If you haven't liked and subscribed, please do so. Tight lines and shoot straight, everyone.